When it comes to American involvement in global history, one of the biggest turning points is World War II. Like World War I, the Second World War was primarily a conflict started by only a few players, but made inevitably global by the persistence of colonialism. For the purposes of this video, we'll focus on the war abroad. The war overseas started with the rise of dictators in several nations. In the Soviet Union, formerly Russia, Joseph Stalin rose as a communist dictator. Benito Mussolini took over as the fascist leader of Italy. In Germany, years of economic depression led to the rise of Adolf Hitler as the leader of a Nazi party, the far-right National Socialist German Workers' Party. His promises of delivering Germany from economic failure and restoring Germany to former glory appealed to the masses of Germany's population. On the other side of the world, the Japanese Empire functioned under the essentially military dictatorship of Hideki Tojo. Japan has a royal family, but Tojo's position as the head of the military gave him unmatched power within the Japanese government. With the rise of dictators came the downfall of the League of Nations. The entire premise behind the League of Nations was the idea of collective security, or the concept that peaceful nations would band together to stop aggressive nations from doing harmful things. In theory, this is a good idea, but it really only works if the aggressor nations are part of the League of Nations as well. Otherwise, the League has really no authority over them unless they decide to go to war. That's the problem that the League runs into here. The League of Nations ultimately fails here because 1, the US and Soviet Union, the two biggest powerhouses at this point, don't join in the first place, and 2, Germany and Japan leave. Now, it should have been a pretty good indicator to the League when Germany and Japan left that they were in for some problems. And Germany's departure already starts some problems that the League of Nations doesn't necessarily handle well. In 1938, Germany annexes Austria, so they essentially waltz in and claim dibs, which in terms of international foreign policy is really not very cool. And in theory, the League of Nations should have a pretty strong negative reaction to this, but they don't. In fact, they don't really do anything. And then Hitler demands the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia that Hitler claimed belonged to Germany. And at the Munich conference during that same year, 1938, Britain and France just agree to give that over to him. You can see all of this as the yellow shaded area on the map. Their thinking is that if they just allow this to happen, maybe Germany will stop here. Maybe Austria and the Sudetenland is all they wanted. This is called appeasement. The idea that if you just give in to someone and give them what they want when they do something bad or wrong or negative, maybe they'll stop there. And 99% of the time, this is a terrible solution. You can see why this is a terrible idea in our cartoon here on the left, which is created by Theodore Giesel, better known as Dr. Seuss. In it, the appeaser in the middle holds out a single lollipop with the hope of making the many-headed monster happy. That might make it, or at least one of the many heads, content for a moment, but it will most definitely be back for more later. Dr. Seuss spent the better part of World War II making all kinds of cartoons, criticizing the America First Committee and their bend towards anti-Semitism, as well as cartoons for the war effort in favor of buying war bonds and the home front efficiency and personal sacrifice. Although it's also worth noting that his cartoons, especially those depicting Hideki Tojo, tended to accentuate racist stereotypes of the time. Hitler in particular did come back for more though, and not that far later. In 1939, he led a surprise attack called the Blitzkrieg, where we get the modern shortened term Blitz against Poland. American involvement in this conflict wasn't by any means immediate. Just like in World War I, we weren't rushing to abandon our stance of isolationism, which had traditionally been our go-to foreign policy stance until this point. In 1935, 2 years after Japan and Germany left the League of Nations, the United States committed to the Neutrality Acts, which created tangible steps to prevent American involvement in future wars. The real push behind this legislation lay in the voices of massive numbers of Americans who were disillusioned with the events of World War I. They looked back on that war after years of thought and tended to agree, in serious hindsight, with the analyses that were propagated by men like Eugene Debs during the war and the writings of the Lost Generation after the war. They largely agreed that the real causes of American involvement in World War I lay in corporate greed and the desire to make money off it. And Americans looked at the events unfolding around them in Europe and the Pacific and didn't want the same thing to happen again. So the Neutrality Acts, which were originally passed in 1935 but added to in 1937 and then again in 1939, stipulated things like that U.S. citizens weren't allowed to travel on ships of nations at war. This seems like common sense, or at least like we as a nation learned from the events of things like the Lusitania crisis in World War I. It also stipulated that in 1937, the United States could sell any materials except for weapons to nations at war, as long as they, one, purchased them with cash, and two, took them away on their own ships. The idea that nations had to pay in cash rather than with loans was especially important because it gave the appearance of not taking sides, but really meant that the US was only selling important non-weapons military items to nations like Britain and France, since they were the only nations in the war at this point who had the ability to really pay in cash. Maintaining the appearance of neutrality was critical, even if we weren't actually being neutral in our actions, because if challenged, we wanted to be able to have deniability, the ability to say that technically we were leaving things open to everyone and not picking sides the way that people wouldn't have a reason to attack us. This was called cash and carry. After Japan's invasion of mainland China in the summer of 1937, President Roosevelt delivered a speech in Chicago that marked a slight departure from the U.S.'s total commitment to the line of neutrality. In what's now called the Quarantine Speech, Roosevelt emphasized that it was the duty of peaceful nations to stand up to aggressive nations. His argument was that collectively, peaceful nations had to work to quarantine hostile nations, like one would quarantine a hostile virus attacking a population, which was something that Americans were very familiar with given their recent experience with the influenza pandemic of 1918. This departure from isolationist rhetoric, followed by intensified conflict in Europe after the Munich Conference and Hitler's blitzkrieg in Poland, led to the formation of the America First Committee, an extreme isolationist organization. The America First Committee continued to espouse a lot of the same criticisms that had led to the creation of the Neutrality Acts to begin with, which were that corporate greed was the primary driving force behind American involvement in foreign conflict, and that involvement in war would lead to the curtailing of civil liberties. In addition to these common criticisms, they argued that the U.S. should put America first rather than send any aid to other countries. The committee believed that the U.S. should focus on defense because no country would attack a successfully defended United States, and that lending aid to other nations, even our friends, would weaken our own position. In essence, the United States should put America first, hence the name. The committee's goals and even name promoted exclusionary ideas, though, and in September 1941, their spokesperson, Charles Lindbergh, made these very obvious in a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, where he blamed Jews for being, quote, war agitators. Criticism against the America First Committee mounted from a lot of directions, but few were quite as direct as Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel. In the cartoon on the left, the America First Committee is seen as reading a book to children titled Adolf the Wolf, which says, quote, "And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children and it didn't really matter." Clearly a commentary on America First's lack of understanding that cutting off aid to our allies would mean the suffering of civilians of all ages, including innocent children. The cartoon on the right takes a critical approach of their stance on defense. From the perspective of the mice, which represent Americans, within the Tower of Books, they're safe. But from the perspective of the cats, who represent Hitler and Tojo, the mice are easy to kill. The message here is that we can build up our defenses all we want, but if we're not actively engaged in what's going on in the world, we won't know if we're truly safe or not. So by the end of 1940 and the start of 1941, the war is not going well in Europe for our friends Britain and France, so they ask for help. In response, Congress authorizes what's called the Lend-Lease Act, which says that the United States can lend or lease, rather than sell, any wartime materials or supplies to, quote, any nation whose defense is vital to our own. So again, this essentially means we're helping our friends, since if Britain or France were to fall to Nazi Germany, we'd likely be next. But in theory, Germany or Italy or Japan can't be super mad because all one of them would have to do is switch sides in the war and they could also get war supplies. So if their defense became vital to our defense, we'd also be very happy to lend or lease them supplies too. So technically, still a more or less neutral law. At the same time that we're sending our lended and leased supplies to Europe, a whole group of pilots is headed over to China with supplies. The Flying Tigers were a group of pilots out of mostly East Texas who flew into China with supplies to help the Chinese, who were our friends at this point, fight against the Japanese military, even if it was just from hunger. It's important to realize that as of the spring of 1941, when they start flying, we are not in the war yet. So these guys are volunteers. This means that if they get caught by the Japanese Air Force, they're pretty much on their own. The US isn't sending in reinforcements to help them, at least not until after we declare war and have the Air Force involved. Once we do officially declare war, many of them join up with the Air Force officially and continue flying. If you're interested in their stories, Texas A&M University at Commerce has an excellent repository of oral histories with a ton of the Flying Tigers that you can check out through their library. In August of the same year, 1941, Winston Churchill and Roosevelt get together and meet about what they think the world should look like after the war is over, because really there's no time like the present to start planning for the future. And they agree on the general principles that this war is not about things like gaining territory or colonies or anything like that. They also agree that after the war is over, they should really be focused on things like having freedom of the high seas, meaning international waters, and having a commitment to really ending war, like for real this time. American neutrality obviously ends with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The reason Japan attacked Pearl Harbor was actually because of oil. Because of Japan's actions in China, the US refused to sell oil to them. This meant that they had to steal oil from Indonesia, but they knew that as soon as they did that, we'd be all over them. So the Japanese military made the strategic decision to take out our military base at Pearl Harbor so that we wouldn't go after them when they went to go to Indonesia to get their oil. You can see the overall damage statistics on the screen, but this was the largest attack on the United States until September 11th, 2001. When it comes to the war in Europe, there are only a few key things that I need us to focus on as turning points. The first is the Normandy landings on D-Day, June 6, 1944. This group effort on the part of the Allied powers was coordinated by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who we'll talk about more later in the Cold War. In the very condensed version of this, our groups here landed on the beaches of Normandy with the purpose of storming the beaches and heading inland to liberate Paris. In theory, this sounds pretty easy, except that these beaches were heavily fortified with machine gun nests, artillery, and the men were working from a position of literally no cover. As soon as they got even close to the shore, they were targets of enemy fire that didn't end until they were close enough to the enemy to be literally underneath their guns. Many of the young men who stormed the beaches weren't far out of high school either. Many of the men were successful in their attack of the beaches at Normandy, though, and made it to Paris. In December 1944, the Germans attempted a counterattack on the liberation of Paris, known as the Battle of the Bulge. As you can see from the map, it's given this name from the bulge shape of the battle lines, Germans in red, Allies in blue. The Germans used a massive number of troops and the topography of the heavily wooded and hilly area to their advantage. Allied forces didn't win the battle until they were able to send for air reinforcements weeks later to bomb the German lines. The other significant event that occurred as a result of the war in Europe was the Holocaust. But the causes of the Holocaust, at least as they relate to our global conflicts, go back further than just this conflict. They go back at least to the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles intensified conditions of economic depression and conflict in Germany that created a political atmosphere friendly to Adolf Hitler. In the early years of his political career, the United States was a fan of Hitler. He had tangible plans to help Germany economically, he ensured that the German people didn't starve, and generally wasn't saying or doing things that were drastically different than anything happening in the United States. In fact, it's an unfortunate reality that some of his programs for sterilization and eugenics were ideas he took directly from the United States, the state of California to be specific. But over time, as often happens, Hitler's message became intensely right-wing. He shut down any form of dissent, began circulating patriotic forms of education that weren't accurate portrayals of German history at the expense of non-white German people, and used hate-filled speech and thinking to fuel his decisions. This led to his master plan for Germany, of which the final solution was to murder all European Jews. And I want to point out that the Holocaust didn't start off with concentration camps and gas chambers. It started off with small things like the boycott of Jewish businesses or publications showing people how to tell the differences between Jews and non-Jews. We had publications like these in the United States during World War II, by the way, but about Japanese Americans. Then things like Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, when Jewish-owned homes and businesses were burned and destroyed in 1938. Then the segregation of Jews into separate communities known as ghettos, then taking away their property rights, then removal to concentration camps where they were worked to literal death or killed in gas chambers. The image on the bottom right of the screen is a box of wedding bands stolen from Jewish victims upon arrival at these concentration camps. Nazis melted the gold and other metals down to use during the war for money, and would steal jewelry and even metal from people's teeth fillings. Boxes like these are just one of the many objects that give a sense of the immensity of the roughly 12 million people killed during the Holocaust. Even though it was happening at the same time, the strategy for war in the Pacific was quite different from that in Europe. Our Pacific troops were led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was in charge of the Navy, and General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the Army. Since the war in the Pacific required both an Army and Navy presence, these men had to work together to guarantee success for all of the missions. In broad terms, the American strategy in the Pacific was called island hopping. This meant that we started essentially at Pearl Harbor once we got enough ships ready, and went from one island to the next in the direction of Japan, liberating them one by one. At each stop, we'd leave some people behind to defend it if necessary, and then move on to the next. One of our priorities was reaching the Philippines, where the U.S. and Filipino forces were forced to surrender to the Japanese after they attacked Pearl Harbor. With no reinforcements anywhere near, the Japanese military forced our troops to march 60 miles through the jungle to rail lines where they sent them to POW camps. This was after the initial attack on the island, so many of the troops were already in terrible condition, and on top of that, the jungle is a super hostile place. Around 5,000 Americans died on what's now called the Bataan Death March in 1942. The Navy didn't arrive to liberate the island until October 1944. In June 1942, the Navy reached Midway Island, the site of one of the biggest turning points in the Pacific theater. Super obviously named, Midway lay as a halfway point in the American plan in the Pacific Ocean. But as they got closer to mainland Japan, battles became increasingly violent and costly. By 1945, the U.S. took the islands of the Philippines, Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Just like the First World War, America's involvement in the Second World War wasn't inevitable, far from it. In our next lesson, we'll look at how the United States mobilized to meet the needs of this conflict and how this compared to the First World War.